Sick and Augusta's totally fine. Genus Cottrell, banjos. Great. Thank you. Augusta's totally fine. Cottrell, Augusta's totally fine.
Oh, is that the live stream?
Yes, it is indeed live.
All right.
We'll wait for a few minutes. Chris, you want to play a couple banjo tunes?
Sure, I'll play a couple banjo tunes. Why not?
Is that the live stream? Yeah, sorry, I have to.
It's. Okay, that sounds great. So it's 7 o'clock. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Augusta 2021. This is All Handwork with Christine. My name is Hannah, and I'm going to be the Zoom host. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsors. Our programming is made possible with the generous support from the West Virginia Department of Arts, Culture, and History, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Davis and Elkins College. Most of all, we would like to thank you. Contributions like yours have enabled us to keep Augusta thriving over these past 18 months, bringing quality traditional arts into our participants' homes during the pandemic and as we begin to transition back to in-person events. Thank you for helping us keep communities connected safely. Participants are going to be muted during this presentation, but you can share questions, comments in the chat, and I'll sort of keep an eye on those as we go through Chris's presentation. And all of these classes are going to be recorded and archived under the Zoom links and archived videos lesson on Augusta's website. So without further ado, Chris, you can take it away. We have a few more people joining, which is great. But this presentation was also sponsored by West Virginia Humanities Council, so I'll be putting their links in the chat as well.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming today. And thank you, Hannah, for the introduction. Thank you, Emily, for having me, and for the Augusta Heritage Center for having me back again to teach this year. It's a big honor to be here, and I'm just humbled by the experience and by the ability to be a part of it. A bit about me before we begin. My name is Christopher W. Dean, and I was born and raised in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, although I'm currently local to Seattle, Washington now. I'm a 15-year veteran elementary music teacher. I've been teaching throughout Virginia, Maryland, DC, and now this greater Seattle area here in Washington. I've been playing banjo for about almost going on 20 years, and grew up listening to banjo players like Andy Borman, who was also a banjo repair person and a barber by trade. And when I grew up, he used to go around to all the schools in the Eastern Panhandle and play banjo for us. And we get to see him each year in our cafeteria. So a little bit about some of my teachers for banjo. I figured to go ahead and give you the brief history of me, at least. I've primarily learned to play banjo from Ben Townsend and Tim Bing, and also Andrew Dunlap. Although I've also spent a lot of time with David Odell, Jimmy Costa, and Reed Martin. And I've been building banjos on and off again for about 12 years. And Genus Cottrell is kind of the person who kind of brought me into this banjo building craze. And just by the fact that if I get into a hobby and there's something that can be made in that hobby, I'm going to learn how to make it. Part of that comes from growing up and being the third with two generations of carpenters to influence me. Before I get started with the slideshow, there will be some times I'm going to have a slideshow presentation for you today on Genus Cottrell. There will be some videos, and there will be some times when I change from the presentation because I'm going to be playing a tune. Apologies as I just deal with unsharing and sharing the presentation as we go through this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. And thank you all so much for coming out today. And also thank you for taking the time to be here. And if you have any questions during this, please feel free to ask them in the chat box. If I notice them, once I notice them, I'll start hitting on some questions. And if I forget to get to yours, I'll definitely get to it by the end. One other thing I'd love to mention is I'm always looking for new information about Genus and new history. And one of the greatest things about learning about Genus Cottrell for me is the people that I've met, the stories that I've heard, and the conversations that I've had, and the friendships that have been built. So if you knew Genus or knew anything about him as you're watching, please feel free to go ahead and send it in the chat box, or you can send me an email at cwdean, D-E-A-N, at banjos@gmail.com, and I'd love to get into some correspondence with you if you've known him. All right, so today's a session title, Genus Cottrell All Hand Work. Actually comes from the title of a short 10-minute documentary that the State Archives commissioned and had Dr. Gaynor do, and they went to his house and talked about the work he did and kind of did some tours of his house. And that video is located in West Virginia University's library. I believe it's at Fairmont State, and then also in the State Archives down in Charleston. So I would encourage you, although I don't have that video here today, I would encourage you all to check that out. Moving on. So today's session is titled All Hand Work after that documentary. And kind of before I get into about what we're going to do in this session, kind of one of the things that I hear the most, one of the biggest questions I get is, why Genus? What attracted you to Genus? And for me, I knew about Genus as a woodworker for years as a kid, hearing about the quality of his craftsmanship and the things that he made. But it wasn't until I started playing banjos that I discovered that he made banjos. And because I've always been a maker of sorts with the hobbies I get into, whether it's Civil War reenacting or rock climbing or hiking or playing music, I've always got to figure out some way to make something that is involved with that. So I always have to be hands-on. And so naturally that kind of led me to wanting to build a banjo, and then seeing just how wicked and wild Genus's banjos look, as you can see in the picture on this slide. I was just immediately like, whoa, what is this? I have to learn how to make this. I have to see one. And at first I was like, I have to be able to get one of these, which is, they're really hard to find. So once I discovered that, I was like, okay, well, I'm definitely going to make one of these. And then the rest is kind of history. So throughout this session today, we're going to take some time to learn about the life and the banjos of Genus Cottrell. He was such a really interesting person, and there's so many great stories about him and personal accounts and just such great information about his life and the people that he was around. So we're going to get into some of that. I have 2 videos of Genus talking about his banjos. One comes from YouTube that actually Kim Johnson put up, and then the other one is a video that I have from the West Virginia State Archives that highlights not only Genus, but also makers and artisans around the state during the arts and crafts revival. We're going to get through those videos. We're going to get to hear some audio of Genus playing, and his playing style was it was kind of difficult for others to play with, not only because of the tuning that he used, but also just because some of the liberties he took while he played. We're going to get to see examples of Cottrell's banjo craft, meaning examples of his banjos, of the different styles that he made, and I'm going to talk extensively about those banjos. We're also going to get to see other things that he made in addition to his banjos, and some of the things that he did for arts and crafts, for the arts and crafts movement, and some of the things that some of the furniture and buildings that he made as well. And then I'm going to be playing a couple of Genus Cottrell tunes. One of them is probably one of his most widely played instrumental tunes, called Minnow on a Hook, or Minnow on a Hook for those of you who are not of the dialect. And then the other one is a version of Sourwood Mountain that, to my knowledge, has never been recorded and has only been passed down. And then at the end and throughout, I'm going to have time for questions, and I would really love to be able to dialogue with you and the questions that you have about Genus. So it's tune time to start out. I'm going to play the tune for you called Minnow on a Hook. And this is, like I said, this is one of Cottrell's most widely played tunes. It's one that he played on stage almost every time he went on stage. He performed it in double C, which is standard for him. He was quoted with once saying, if you tune in double C, well, something to the effect of, if you tune it in double C, you only have to tune it once and never have to tune your banjo again. So that's why he preferred that key. And so that tuning is the high strings G followed by a C, G, C, D. And one thing that made this tune, mine's going to be a little bit different from Genus's, is because he was super free with timing on stage. Most of the recordings that we have of Genus were made at festivals when he was performing. And he loved performing for people, and he loved putting on some showmanship and just being maybe a little ridiculous with his tunes from time to time. And so there are some times where he'd play through a phrase and there might be 4 beats in the phrase in the tune, but he would make it sometimes 10 or 12 just with the pauses and the strums that he would take. Makes it really difficult to try and learn his tunes too, exactly how he played them. So I'm going to be playing Minor on a Hook for you, but I'm going to play it more in standard 4/4 time with some embellishments that Genus Cottrell would have added into his playing. So I'll stop sharing, and then this is going to be Minor on the Hook. All right. So Minor on a Hook. All right, thanks. So that's Minor on a Hook from Genus Cottrell. And something to note about his playing with that tune, sorry about that, just spilled some water. Something to note about the playing of his tune is that there are sometimes he would play that simple tune for just going on 5 minutes in some of his recordings. And he generally always tried to add a little bit of excitement to that tune each time that he replayed each of the phrases. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and head on back to our presentation. Just give me a second to share screen. And back to Minor on a Hook. Okay, so a little bit about Genus himself and his history. He was born and raised in Clay County, West Virginia. He spent his whole life there, and he lived on his ancestral property. He was born September 4th, 1901, and he died on December 7th, 1980. And 1901, it's interesting to note about Genus is he always had a silver dollar that he turned into a belt buckle that was from the year 1901. And if you see any of the photos of him with his shirt tucked in, you're going to end up seeing that belt buckle from his birth year. And so yeah, he spent his entire life there in Deadfall Mountain, which is their ancestral home, like I said, which is a mountain just outside of Ivydale, West Virginia, about probably 3.5 miles or so. And he is buried in I can't remember the name of the cemetery, but it's the right off the Big Otter exit. As soon as you get off that exit in West Virginia, um, and it's right across the street from the gas station, straight off the exit on the hillside. Both he and his sister Sylvia O'Brien, are both buried there. So some of the things about Genus is sorry, I got so the Cottrells were some of the earliest settlers there in Clay County, in that area of West Virginia, and they spent his entire lives there, and they liked to live, especially as we got into the mid 1900s and latter 1900s. Genus liked to live by what he called the old ways. They didn't have running water or gas or electricity, and they lived this way by choice, although most of the houses around them had started to get electricity and running water at that time. Um, and the Deadfall Mountain there is actually named by their family after a type of bear trap. There was this giant bear that was kind of terrorizing the area there before they built their house, and they had to get one of the largest bear traps that they could find to catch this bear. And that specific type of bear trap is called the Deadfall, and so that's how they got the name for their ancestral property. And growing up, Genus and his family were known as tobacco farmers. They primarily farmed all their property with tobacco and sold to the people locally. But they were also known as chair makers at that time too. And it's important to note that during the Great Depression, when they would go out to sell things, that they could almost always come back with money from selling their chairs, not having to barter for chickens or anything like that. They would barter for other items with other items that they had, but for their chairs, Genus always made note to say that they were always able to make a dollar, not just a dollar, but make money off their chairs. And talking with some of Genus's friends, or his apprentice, his name was Dwayne Duffield. Dwayne had told me that the kind of mindset at the time was that although you may not have a lot day to day, people wanted to do better for their kids at that time, and it was very important for families especially in Appalachia, and especially in West Virginia, for them to have chairs at their dinner table for their kids. And it was just because dinner was a time for the family to come together. It was also a time for you to share struggles, but also share hopes. And so it was really important for people to have chairs, proper chairs, for their dinner table. And so that's one of the reasons that Genus credited to being able to make money during the Great Depression. And so they continued doing their tobacco farming and chair making up until the time that his dad died. And as soon as his dad died, Genus uh, stopped growing tobacco, stopped farming tobacco, and just went strictly into woodworking. And he got most of his woodworking skills from his uncle, actually, who spent a lot of time at their homestead, building outbuildings, and then eventually their house. And all the parts of the house were made by hand, no power tools, and with the tools that Genus's uncle used. Um, and these are tools that later Genus would then inherit from his uncle and end up using in his Banjo building. Let's see. It's important to note that Genus also spent most of his life living with his sister. They both lived in that house that was built by the family. There's only a short time where Sylvie actually moved to Montana. She got married and moved to Montana and was out working on ranches out in Montana, and she was essentially in charge of the household of the ranch and cooking and supporting everyone, all the ranchers. And their house, as you'll see in just a little bit, was actually decorated with a lot of animal horns and skulls and and the like that she brought back from out west. Let's see. All right. So I'll go ahead on to the next slide. So this picture is one that I just want to show you. It's of a Cottrell family reunion. So this is a family reunion that actually Genus attended in 1920. I have not been able to locate him in the photo, but this is where both sides of the Cottrell family got together. The Cottrells that eventually ended up moving to Roane County, and the Cottrells from Clay County are represented in this picture. It's also worthwhile to point out that the McCumbers and the Parsons are also relatives of the Cottrells, and there are many Parsons and McCumbers represented in this photo as well. And I just think it's really neat to see just in that close proximity of an area, you know, Roane County is not too far from Clay, just how many folks came from the same group of people, and how many people were just family, which is something that we can still see some in West Virginia, but we don't see huge swaths of families staying within one county or within one region of West Virginia today. All right, so I'm going to get into talking a little bit about the Cottrell homestead now. And these are some photos of the Cottrell house. So the early homestead was, as I said, was built entirely by hand by Genus, his dad, and his uncle. The tools that they were used were mainly Cottrell's uncle's, and they were the same ones that he inherited and used in his own woodwork. The house was in like a T shape. So you have the front of the house being the top of the T, and then there would be a central hallway going back through. And it was only the front part of the house that was 2 stories. And if you look, it's kind of hard to see on the siding there, but the siding, all the siding and all the floor, well actually all the wood from the house came from the property and was milled right on the property. And the siding is all tongue and groove, like shiplap. And same way with the floors in the house are all shiplap, tongue and groove flooring. But the flooring and the siding was all done by hand as well. And they actually used tongue and groove planes to plane all the lumber on the exterior of the house and the flooring of the house. Which, if you think about just trying to do tongue and groove on maybe a 12-inch piece of wood, it's going to take you a few minutes to get the tongue side, and then another few minutes to get the groove side by using your hand planes. So if you think about having to do that for an entire house, you can start to imagine just how much work went into building that structure. And so Genus also liked to claim, like if you look at the property, the picture at the bottom has the picture of the house on the hill. And Genus would always claim that this was the part of West Virginia that people took photos from the most. And it was just his claim to fame for his ancestral home. And he felt, because he always had people coming out to the house to visit, there are always people just coming up the road to take photos because they had heard about this spot. So in his mind, this was the most photographed spot throughout all of West Virginia. And then, as I said before, they lived without electricity or modern plumbing and gas and water by choice, and they continued to learn in the old style that he had grown up with. Right, so this is slides. This slide is a little bit more of the homestead, and these are photos that I've collected from people over the years who have just sent me emails and just or who I've corresponded with, just trying to learn more about Genus. You could see up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see 2 of Genus's outbuildings. Picture next to it being Sylvie's stove, which from what I've heard from people that grew up around them, it was a pretty rare sight to see her stove not being used. There was almost always something being cooked on the stove, on the cooktop, and she was always hosting people. To the right of that, you can see some steer horns on the fireplace, and in the background, you can see that tongue and groove, the tongue and groove walls in the house as well. But the steer horn that's over the fireplace is one of the items that Sylvia brought back from Montana after her husband had passed away. The top picture on the right is Sylvia playing in the house. You'll notice in the door in the background is painted white and kind of like a robin's egg blue, which was one of her favorite color combinations. And not only was it painted on the doors throughout the house, but she had a pie hutch that that was one of her favorite, most prized possessions that Genus had made her out of wormy chestnut, and it was painted those colors as well. The banjo that she is playing is actually one that was Genus's stage banjo, and after Genus. There are a few interesting things about this banjo that I'll get into a little later, but every time Sylvie went and performed on stage or performed with one of the banjos, she would, after Genus passed away, she would also take out Genus's banjo and play that too as a tribute to him. The bottom left-hand corner, you can see Genus picture from inside Genus's shop. With there's some antlers there that Sylvie brought back from Montana as well. And you can look back against the wall. You can see Genus's German-style shaving horse, where he would shave spindles, and he would be doing using a draw knife to make so many of the arts and crafts items that he sold at festivals throughout the state. You can see some sticks leaning against the wall. Those are some hickory sticks that will eventually become shepherd's crooks, walking sticks. You can see some banjo tension hoops hanging up on the wall, and then there are various wood in the background for making chairs, which he made a lot of chairs throughout his life. And then you can see another picture of this workshop, and down in the bottom right-hand corner, another view of the property from the house. All right, so now I'm going to get into some of Genus's work other than his banjo work. And so these are three items that I was able to take photographs of when I visited my friend John D. Morris, who knew Genus all of his life, and actually lives just a few miles down from Genus's old home place. And so in the top left-hand corner, we see a shepherd's crook with two different types of wood, with walnut on the bottom, and I believe that's maple on the top. And he would fuse them together. He would use green wood for the top and bottom, and he would fuse them together with metal in the center, just a metal sleeve to give them strength. The item in the top right-hand corner is a violin stand, and to my knowledge and to John Morris's knowledge, it's the only violin stand that Genus Cottrell ever made. And then in the bottom picture is Genus's bat brand. He made baseball bats. Now I'll talk about that just a little more in just a moment, but he made baseball bats, and he called his baseball bats League. And you can see his name on the right-hand side is stitched, almost looks like it's stitched in, but he used an awl and would nail his name into it. And same way with his brand label, the League for League Baseball. So, as I said earlier, earlier that they were known as tobacco farmers and chair makers. During the Depression, they were able to sell chairs, and he changed to woodwork after his father died. Genus made cabinets, like not just hutches or pie chests, but he actually made kitchen cabinets too that would go under countertops or be hanging from the ceiling. He made tables, just small tables, side tables, and full legitimate dining room tables with leaves that would be able to drop in. He made desks, small simple desk, and larger office desks. I talked to a person in North Carolina who had a desk that was about 5 foot wide and a couple feet deep. That was for his dad's office. And he made baseball bats, and he repaired farm equipment. And with the farm equipment, he would spend hours each day just making wooden pins to be able to put the sleighs back on wooden sleds for moving like hay and wheat throughout the hillsides. And he would any wooden part that could wear out on a wagon or sleigh, he would always make throughout the winter, so that he would have plenty for all of his neighbors to be able to do their farming. Genus really became popularized during the arts and crafts movement, in which he, kind of monopolized off that movement and created a lot of different things to sell at festivals. And he was really well known, really famous for his spring pole lathe that he would bring from his shop to the festivals, and he would be operating the lathe, just making different items and toys and whistles and different things on it, and kind of just showing off for the people, but also just a chance to show how he created his pieces. And so for the arts and crafts fairs and festivals, he would make walking sticks and billy clubs for people. He would make these little wooden whistles with metal sleeves that were just really like ear-piercing whistles. He'd make different toys for kids, rolling pins, and and he would make his banjos as well. Uh, and and to get back to the baseball bat, one of the reasons that I have this picture in here is that Genus was really well known throughout Charleston, West Virginia, for making his baseball bats, and he actually made baseball bats at the time for the Charleston Charlies, which was a minor league baseball team. And before training would start, many of the baseball players would just be trickling in and out of his banjo, out of his workshop, coming up to get Genus to make them baseball bats for the season. And the players would come up, they'd get lunch or have a meal. They'd be able to talk to Genus. He would make them a few bats, and they'd get to inspect the bats, and he'd customize them for the players right then and there. And then they'd go back and have bats for at least a portion of their season. And anytime they needed more bats, they'd end up going back up to Genus's house and then bringing their bats down and playing with his league bats throughout the season. And I have no idea how many bats he made throughout. And this is actually one of the only baseball bats of his that I have seen to survive. All right, and so here are a couple more photos of some things that Genus has made. Pictured on the left and right hand side, I was fortunate enough to take a picture of this from my friend John Morris. This is the only fiddle that Genus ever made. He attempted making one. I don't know if it was for fun or if it was just to try and have for a friend to learn how to play fiddle. It doesn't resonate that well because it's rather thick, but it is made entirely out of walnut, and the neck going into it is actually a solid piece, and which glues to the back, and then the sides are mortised in. So it's not like a typical violin where you have the willow neck block and then you end up attaching the neck to it. This was all one solid piece. In the top center, painted red, you'll see one of Genus's chairs. And this is one of the only chairs that I know of his that still actually has the original bottom to it. This one is from a set that belongs to my friend Dwayne Duffield that I used to borrow and take around to me when I was setting up workshops teaching on Genus Cottrell. And he over the years there would have been painted several different colors, but a lot of his were painted that were either not painted or they were painted that blue color that was a favorite of Sylvie. And down in the center you could see two hutches. These two hutches were made by Genus, and these are hutches that were actually in his original house until the time that that Sylvia had died. And a friend of mine was able to send me pictures of these original items of Genus's. All right, so now I have more pictures of Genus's workshop here and working space and house and property. These pictures were given to me by Jimmy Costa, who lives out near Hinton, West Virginia. And Jimmy Costa is kind of like, well, he's kind of like a walking West Virginia encyclopedia. He knows so many things about so much of the folk life in West Virginia, and he's been a great resource as I've been learning about Genus. So Jimmy went out to Genus's property in 1968, but Genus was not there. So he was hosted by Sylvie, who let him walk around the property. And again, you have that in the center of that page, you have that iconic shot that's from Genus's front porch that so many people came to take pictures of. And the top left, you can see the house straight on, this is a much better picture than the colored pictures that you saw earlier, because the trees are just kind of baby trees in this photo, and they allow you to see the rest of the house. On the top right hand side is a picture inside of his workshop, and you can see that same shaving horse that was in the other picture, and as well as you have kind of a flat shave horse here that would have been a flat bench that he would have been using a lot for his chair making. And then down in the right hand corner you can see that's his famous foot lathe, his spring pole foot lathe, which used kind of originally was a green tree branch that actually hung down from the rafters in his shop and was tied to some rawhide, wrapped around whatever piece of equipment or piece of wood he wanted to turn, and then attached to just a stick that wasn't attached to anything and just hung down from the bottom, and he would spend hours just pumping that lathe with his foot and would go rotate clockwise and counterclockwise. So with a spring pole lathe, you're actually cutting twice. You're cutting on two strokes, each stroke of the foot pole. And this is the same lathe that he would take to Ravenswood, to the West Virginia State Folk Festival, that he would take down to Charleston, and any event that he was going to be selling at, he would fold. It had folding legs on it, and he would just take that, and then he would find cracks. Like if he was set up at a house, he would find cracks in the bricks and loose bricks to be able to stick the pole where the loose brick was, so that would give the appropriate tension, and then he'd be able to use his spring pole lathe. Okay, so this next part is actually, this is from a magazine. These are some photos from a magazine, which was part of a Catholic mission coming from Ohio called Glen Mary's, oops, sorry about that, that was a banjo. Called Glen Mary's Challenge, and it was a quarterly magazine that would come out talking about artisans and people throughout Appalachia, especially throughout southwestern Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and southeastern Ohio, and sections of eastern Kentucky. And it took me, I discovered this magazine probably about 3 years ago, as I found out about a banjo that Genus made that was a tenor not a tenor, but a long neck banjo, the only long neck banjo Genus ever made, and it was featured in this article, and so I was able to find out about this article and then trace down the magazine. And so you can see photos of the canning that they did with fruits and vegetables for their winter. You can see in here kind of a quick sharpening stone, Genus splitting, cross-cutting timber with his crosscut saw, just his hands and a draw knife in the upper right hand corner, and you can see down the bottom right hand corner his house with some of the outbuildings. And a great thing about this, about receiving word about this magazine and be able to locate a copy about this magazine, was I was able to see some pictures of his property and shop that I had never seen before, or with such clarity, because so many of the photos that were taken of his property were pretty blurry. And so this article that they did was Craftsman on a Mountaintop, and it focused on his life, and it focused on his banjos, but also kind of focused on his viewpoint. And part of he didn't really consider like living without electricity or without water as being impoverished, and he thought of his daily life as being a very wealthy person, because he made enough to survive comfortably off his work, and he was able to live a full, long and fulfilled life. And he was quoted in here was suspecting that a lot of West Virginians, and particularly, were seen as being impoverished because they didn't have the extra money to buy things that they didn't really need, of all the modern conveniences. And he thought that if you really thought about what you needed from day to day, and if you could support yourself to get those things, then you weren't impoverished, and that was only somebody else's viewpoint placed onto you. And so there are many, many more pics from this magazine, and I have pictures of this up elsewhere that I'd be more than happy to share with you. All right, so now we're going to take some time to get into talking about some banjos about Genus Cottrell, which is, my biggest geek out point when I'm talking about him. And here, no banjos in this photo, but here are some pictures of him working on his spring pole lathe in front of people, and probably it looks like he's making some rolling pins on the right hand side, and probably in the left hand side too. But you can kind of get a better sense for how that machine works from these photos. All right, so we're going to throughout this time I'm going to talk a little bit about his banjos and how they were constructed, and whenever possible, he did, or all the work he did on his banjos was all by hand. And if there was anything that was needed to be done to a banjo that required an electric machinery, he would give it to a friend to do, and there's typically only one or two things that he would get done, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. He liked to scavenge for his parts for his banjos, for making tailpieces, for making bridges, for making armrests, and I'll show you some more pictures about that as well. So the tension hoops for his banjos, and I might as well just go to the next page. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. There we go. So the tension hoops from his banjos were made out of aluminum that he got from stop signs that the state roads would bring to him. The state road department, whenever they took down stop signs or took down signs that were large enough for him to be able to use them for banjo parts, and if the signs were old and mistreated and they were just putting up new ones, they would stop by his house and drop off the old signs. And he would end up starting to cut, he would cut those tension hoop brackets with a hacksaw blade. Just a hacksaw blade and a rag as the handle. And he'd have a rag on either end, and he would sit there for hours just like cutting out tension hoops, tension hoop after tension hoop. And then he would file it down and bend it, and then would use pop rivets to cut them together, and use hand file to file down all the notches for each of the banjo tension hoops. His banjos at the time, from 1965 until about 1979, his banjos cost about $90, give or take. If you couldn't afford $90 for a banjo, he would be like, all right, we'll take off some brackets. And he'd take off 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 brackets and try and get it down to a price range that was approachable by people. And then also, if people wanted more brackets on their banjos, like a standard banjo, he would charge a little bit more for that. And the most money he ever sold one banjo for is the very last banjo he he sold before he died, and this was in 1979, and he died in 1980, but he sold it for $135. That was the most money he made out of any of his banjos. And he is credited with saying, or he told Dwayne Duffield, that he made about 100 banjos. He didn't keep track. He put his name on most of them. A lot of them early on he didn't put any maker's name on, and I'll talk to you more in a little bit about how you can identify some of his banjos. So I'm going to show you a video now. This is called Genus Cottrell Clay County Banjo Maker, and this is one that has come from the archives, but my friend Kim Johnson put up onto the internet, and it's him talking about his banjos and how he builds them. Two things that are really interesting to note in this banjo is that this banjo that he's playing is the last banjo that Genus made personally for himself, and it is the only torque converter banjo that has a neck that is made out of wood that is not black walnut. He used Osage orange on this neck, and he used a walnut fingerboard and walnut veneer on the peg head, which is very different from him because all of his other torque converter banjos were all solid pieces of walnut, no veneer, and the fingerboard was just the top of the banjo. And then also to note, there is a pink bridge on this banjo, and it's a pink bridge with little blue speckled flakes, and it's a comb that he got from a barber shop. And I remember growing up as a kid, there used to be those cardboard cutouts in the barbershops, and you could be able to slide a comb out that you would need. There would be like green ones, and then there would be pink ones. And this was one of those combs. And he cut it down to make a banjo bridge out of. And I have never been able to find they were everywhere when I was a kid, but I've never been able to find one of these combs since then. And then the last thing I'll say about this, or he's also going to play Minnow on the Hook in this piece. And the final thing I'm going to say about this little video is that at the end, he does this little finger flick thing where he pretends like he's flicking the strings with his fingers, but if you look in his left hand, he's just doing pull-offs and just doing sleight of eye. And it was one of his signature ways to end his concerts with his banjo pieces. So let's all take a listen.
I want to tell a little something about how I build banjos now. The first banjo ever I made has been, I expect, 50 years ago. It was a wood rim banjo. I played on that banjo a while, and I decided I'd make a metal rim banjo, and it beat the wood rim. And I sold the wood rim banjo, and I don't know what's ever become of it. It's probably tore up before now. And I kept the metal rim banjo, and I played on it a long time, and finally bought me a new banjo, a factory-made one, and I sold the one I had, and I played on it a long time, and then I went into it and made me a banjo of my own again, and I liked it. It had such a good tone. I sold a factory banjo, and I've stayed with my own make of banjos ever since, and that's been several years. And to make these banjos, this is the last style. These banjos, this is out of a 56 model Buick transmission. Automatic transmission makes the body of this banjo, but it's a little bit too wide. I have to cut off about 3/4 of an inch band off the bottom of this to make it down narrow enough for the depth of the banjo, up and down. And then I take a metal plane and I smooth it. Then I take sandpaper and I shine it. Then the next thing is to drill the holes for the bracket lugs ever so far apart around this rim. And then I put them lugs on. And then the next thing is to make this narrow tension hook up here that holds the head. And then I lay the head on, and then lay the tension hook on, and then start adding the brackets. Put them, when I get them all on, well, then I take a bracket wrench and I go around them and tighten the head down to the right tension, tight as I want it. Then the next thing is this neck. I take my wood and I shape it down, cut the square hole through the rim of this banjo for this part of the neck to go through, and then I glue the fingerboard on. And then the next thing is to put these white position spots in there, and then I take a file and even them down perfectly smooth with the fingerboard. And then I put the frets in there next, and I press them in there with clamps. And then I smooth them, even them up perfectly from end to end, so one won't be a little higher than the other one to make the strings rattle or buzz. Then the next thing is to put the keys on. And I put them on, and then the next thing is to varnish and finish the wood part of the banjo. Well, I go ahead and varnish and finish it. And then it's ready for the strings. And I put the strings on. And then I make the bridge and the tailpiece. And put the tailpiece on, and then I put the strings on, and the bridge slips under the strings, and it's the last. It's ready to tune up and start playing something like this.
There we
I
go.
want to tell.
All right, so that was a little bit about Genus being able to share about his banjos. You got to hear a little bit of his playing and see a little bit of his tricks at the end for finishing his pieces. So I'm going to get into, in the next few minutes, the last little bit of the time we have together, talking a little bit about how he built his banjos. The very first banjo he made was made out of a hollowed stump, and he used a groundhog's hide to make the skin for it. Later on, he started making wood rim banjos, and he would take the tops of like cook pots, like the curved top, and he would set it down inside the banjo rim, and that would make a metal tone ring for his banjos. And from there, he started making his first like production model, so to say, like the banjos that he started making for other people, were pressure cookers. Most of those were around 10-inch banjos. Some of them were 10 3/4. Very rarely he would be able to get 11-inch pressure cooker, which those are really hard to find. And so most of his pressure cookers are those 10 and 10 3/4-inch sizes. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner here where you have the picture of him making the only long neck banjo that he ever made. And you can see in the back, on the bottom of that picture, you can see the top of the pressure cooker that has been cut off. He just made slices, and he would get 3 rims out of each pressure cooker. So up until 1965, once he started making a lot of banjos, all of his banjos were, at that point, were pressure cooker banjos. And it wasn't until 1965 that he discovered in the junkyard, that's actually not too far in between his house and Ivydale, he discovered a torque converter from a Buick Dynaflow transmission open on the ground, and inside of it was the first turbine ring. And that turbine ring he saw and thought, well, hey, that'll make a banjo. So he took it home, made a banjo out of it, and kind of the rest is history with that. And he's made more of his torque converter banjos than any of the other banjos that he made. All the banjos were made from wood that was harvested from deadfall, from their property, and he had somebody with a portable sawmill come out and just for like a couple weeks and just like mill out a bunch of his wood. He was said to make over 120 or over 100 banjos. He didn't keep track though. That was just kind of his best guess. But in one winter alone, he made over 25 banjos in 4 months because the weather was so fierce. He just stayed inside and made stuff the whole time. And as I said, many of his banjos sold for $90. The final one was for $135. And here's two pictures. One on the left-hand side, you can see the torque converter assembly that as it comes out of the transmission of the Dynaflow transmission from the mid-50s through early 60s. The design changed a little bit over time, but from the right-hand corner, the second piece where it says first turbine, that's actually the ring that he would use to make the banjos. And on the right-hand side is a picture where the junkyard used to be that he first discovered those torque converter banjos. It's out on Otter Lick. And some characteristics of Genus's banjos. The necks were paired with pressure cookers, and torque converters were all walnut. One single piece, as you can see in the bottom right-hand photo. The fingerboard was just the top portion of the banjo. Built completely by hand tools, and the inlay was all knitting needles, shop lights, like celluloid shop light coverings, refrigerator pan trays for the big ones. He would punch them out with a big hole punch, and bridle covers were all used for inlays. And he had several peghead designs, and he would actually have cutouts of them, patterns, and he had a piece of like wire that he would wrap around them and have them all together so you could like flip through and see which banjo you wanted. For the urethane finish, he used Fabulon, which was a floor urethane that is still sold today, but it's illegal in 48 states because of how caustic it is. And Genus would say how used to be able to date his banjos by how yellow the inlays turned because the oxidation or the chemical reaction between the celluloid from the knitting needles and the chemicals in the floor urethane. So over time, they would turn this like golden color. And then you could tell whether it was an old banjo of his or a new one. So here's some of the banjo peghead designs, and you can see all of his are pretty wild. Like, with the exception of the upper right-hand corner, which was one that he said was kind of regal. He felt it had like a regal feeling to it. They are all patterns, all those, with the exception of that one, are patterns of his own. The peghead in the upper right-hand corner is actually modeled after an older Washburn banjo peghead style, after Washburn started making banjos overseas. But you know, all the others were just banjos that were inspired by his own design, of which I could only guess was probably inspired by things in nature around him. I always get a sense of butterflies a lot from his banjos, but no one that I know ever asked him what his inspiration was for his banjo pegheads. Banjo inlay, he had two different styles. He had the style with the big dots, as you can see in the center two pictures, and they would eventually, as they progressed down the fingerboard, get smaller, down to 1/4 inch size. But then on the extreme left and right, you can see two of them that look kind of like they're modeled after dice, like the 5 off of a dice. And there are less of those banjos out and about, and it's always great to be able to see one because they're so different from his standard, so to say, banjo. Pressure cooker banjos prior to 1965, all of them had a flat pancake walnut resonator that would screw onto the bottom of it. And then he would do inlay designs with with the knitting needles, and all of these banjos were around 10 and a half, 10 and 3/4 inch. I think I know of 2 that were 11-inch banjos, and the bridges on these banjos are always super wide and always made of walnut. And you can tell that the Fabulon really changed the color of these knitting needles to like this really dark, like amber golden color. And then we get into his torque converter banjos. So Genus. One thing I would say about his banjos is in the bottom you can see he has his name on the banjo, Dowstick, and this one is done in permanent marker. Sometimes on the back of his peg heads early on, he would put mail return address stickers that you used to get back especially until the 80s and 90s. I remember them as a kid. You just lick them and stick them right on, and then he would put Fabulon over top of that, and it just had his address. And then other times he would use an awl and just hammer in his name into the peghead and the date that the banjo was finished. You could see several different type. You could see the dowel sticks are rather thick and chunky. The dowel sticks are actually solid with the banjo neck. They're not drilled in or cut at a certain angle before they're put in. It's all carved out by hand. You can see also the metal tail pieces that he had. Those were the bottom of 90-degree edge cook pots, and he would cut those out and then cut them to the shape, and then drill holes in them with a brace, and then put them onto a banjo. You can see the pink bridge there, but you can also see there's a metal bridge too in some of these pictures. And he used aluminum T-bar for that. I tried it myself, and I just couldn't get as loud of a sound as he would get out of his banjos. And then you can see some of the banjos pictured on the right hand. In the center are Genus's personal banjos. Sylvie's on the left, and his on the right with the pink bridge. All the way on the right-hand side, you'll see a banjo that's owned by Glenville State College, and one that is owned by Dwayne Duffield. And then other banjos, he did a lot of different other types of banjos, would do repair work on banjos for people, and if he ever made necks for these banjos, he would not use a walnut neck. He would only use walnut fingerboard. He would typically use cherry. He would also use maple, sometimes locust and mulberry, kind of whatever he had, but mostly it was cherry. And there is actually one banjo of his that exists somewhere that has been lost. That was a cherry-made banjo neck on a factory banjo rim, but the inlay dots were black celluloid, and that banjo has been lost for going on probably about 45 years now. And another thing with it, he would use the knitting needle inlay on these banjos, but something to note on his banjos, he didn't 100% have the geometry correct with his banjos of attaching a rim to the banjo neck. So the banjo rim always was higher, as if every banjo was an arch top. And so it's a little bit awkward to play on some of his banjos that weren't arch top torque converter banjos. And here we have some correspondence between him and between Jimmy Costa and J. Richards Usher, who owned the long neck banjo. And then on the right hand side we have a letter written to the owner, Richie, or Richardson, from Genus, talking about how disgruntled he was with his manager, Ken Davidson, and how he had gotten a lawyer and had felt like he was going to have to threaten Ken Davidson with a gun or something like that. So there's just some interesting correspondence from Genus, talking about that and talking about the banjo that he was building for Richie or Rich. So with we are almost out of time with this, and I don't know. I want to ask if it's okay for me to show this video, or how tight are we on time for this evening?
We can go a little bit over,
Okay.
but just a little bit.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
In the hills, beyond the electric power lines, is another craftsman's shop. One of the characteristics of the Appalachian craftsman is his ingenuity. Genus Cottrell makes fine banjos using pieces of automobiles and local timber. He fashions them with draw knife, foot vise, and foot-powered lathe. With an artisan's pride, Genus tells us how he constructs his banjos.
Well, folks, to tell you how they're built, here is a rim. This is the starter, the body of the banjo. It's a Buick transmission, band out of a Buick transmission. And I cut them down here to the right width. Drill my holes for the brackets that goes on here. And then I put the brackets on. And then I dress out the neck out of black walnut wood, shape it down, fit it to the rim. And then I lay off a fret position. Then I put in these white spots you see in the between the frets. The first thing. Then I put in the frets. After I put in the position dots, I put in them. And then I fit the keys. And then I fit this to this rim. And it's pretty well completed then.
All right, and I'm going to skip ahead so you can hear Genus performing with the Morris Brothers here at the end. And then
Impromptu session.
right, so that's a little bit of Genus Cottrell playing and explaining his banjos a little more.
In the hills beyond the electric.
Always wants to repeat. So over the years, and this is kind of the last thing that I have for us today. Over the years, I've kind of had the honor of being able to collect some of or come across some of Genus's personal items and some banjo necks and some things that were his. And so I have just a couple items here to share. And this is a maple banjo neck that he made for Factory Banjo, and this was one that he made before he died, and this was actually in a burn pile that Sylvie was getting ready to throw into the fireplace, and actually Kim Johnson saved this from the burn pile. But looking up real close, you can see where he made markings on here for the frets. And what he would do for his frets is he had a Gibson fingerboard, and on the edge of the fingerboard where each fret was, he put a little tiny hole. And then each hole, he put a hole on either side, so every fret had 2 holes, and he put a nail in each one. And he put the fingerboard on top of the neck, and he'd go along with a hammer and tap in where those nails were sticking through. And then he would take a straight edge and match the holes with a line, and that's where he would cut his frets. Before that, he would just measure them on one side and use a square, which made it as the frets went down the banjo, they were kind of all tilted on his earlier banjos. So some of his earlier banjos are kind of hard to play in tune up the neck. I also have here is one of his walnut torque converter banjo necks that was never finished because there was a knot that he discovered in it as he was working on it. But you can just see how gigantic, this is a couple inches thick, that dowel stick was, and how it was one complete piece with the neck. And even in here, there's a little bit of a drawing of where he was going to put his fingerboard. I also have an incomplete torque converter that he started in 1979 that has some walnut from his property, and it may have been completed at one time, but the neck is missing because there's some evidence of the Fabulon floor urethane that's on this. And so you can see the inside with all these turbines, and it being an arch top, these banjos can really ring and really make a loud sound, but you can still get a lot of control with them. And the very last thing I want to share with you today are these 2 necks. These are 2 banjo necks that I've been working on. And these are actually from a log that was the last log that Genus Cottrell harvested off of his mountain that Dwayne Duffield brought down in 1979. And then this wood had been air drying for almost 35 years or so. And now I'm working on making some exact reproductions of 2 of Genus's banjos. So I want to thank you before we end. I want to thank you all for coming out today, and thank you for your attendance and for any questions that you may have. I would be so happy to be able to answer them. You can email me or get a hold of me through social media or anything. I'd be happy to chat with you. Thank you all so much for having me, and thanks for coming today.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was great. Really fascinating. I put your email in the chat, so if anyone has questions, you can save the chat with the 3 little dots in the corner. And thank you to the West Virginia Humanities Council for sponsoring this. It'll be available tomorrow morning on the website, so if you want to rewatch anything, it'll be up there. All right.